Take it away, Kyle.
Awesome. Can you see my PowerPoint deck?
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. All right. So thank you everybody for joining us at the Dutch PowerShell user group. That is a fantastic audience considering I heard some iffy things about the traffic going on. Apologies that I couldn't be there in person. This is the 1 week, pretty much this quarter, maybe even this half that I get to be at home. So hopefully the next time I'm able to be out there and join you. So in this session, I'm going to be talking about a fairly new resource that we've been working on, and that's a way to use DSC, or PowerShell Desired State Configuration, and apply that to your vSphere and VMware environments. So let me dive into this. Oh, come on, pointer. There we go. All right, so a little bit about me, in case you have no idea who this voice is coming to you through the Zoom session. My name is Kyle Ruddy. Disclaimer, I do work for VMware, so I'm a Senior Architect for the VMware R&D group, which is responsible for vSphere as well as VMware Cloud on AWS. Now, I also thoroughly enjoy doing different community events, such as user groups, and just a few weeks ago I was out there at the PowerShell conference Asia, and all kinds of things. So I love sharing anything that I can share. So if it's something that's paragraph based, it's out there on my blog. If it's code based, it's on GitHub. If it's something that I can demonstrate, it's at user groups like this, or on a free podcast. It's called the Brown Bag. All of my user credentials are generally KM Ruddy. So if you search that, I'm pretty easy to find.
Kyle, we can currently only see the title slide. Is that correct?
Hopefully you can see my introduction slide. Is that not what you see?
We still see the title slide. So we see Manage vSphere with PowerCLI.
All right, let me stop sharing and try this again. Share.
Yeah, there we go. Perfect.
Any better? Okay, there we go.
Yes.
All right, so now you can see all my stuff there. So hopefully that makes a little more sense now. And then for all the work that I've done through the community, I'm something like an 8-time vExpert and now a 2-time Microsoft MVP. So pretty cool stuff there. So let's go to so can you all see the agenda slide now?
No, we cannot see the agenda slide, but we see you smiling and you have a majestic beard. Yes, there you go.
Oh, now we see the agenda slide? Okay.
Yes.
All right, so here's what I'm going to be talking about. We're going to do a brief overview of configuration management as a whole. As I talk to different groups, it seems that this is still kind of a new concept. PowerShell and PowerCLI, I'll go over that really quick, and then hopefully I have plenty of time for some live demos. So let's roll forward here. So configuration management is basically what's known as, per Wikipedia. Hopefully you can see that screen. If not, hopefully it'll show up here shortly.
No, we cannot see that screen.
Nope. Here, let me switch to, maybe if I just share my whole entire desktop, you'll.
Yes, we can see it.
Now we can see it, okay. Let me move the Zoom weirdness out of the way so I can still see that. Okay, so configuration management is basically a system engineering process to maintain the consistency of whatever it's trying to manage. And the goal here is to manage and maintain that consistency throughout the entire life cycle of that node, of whatever it's trying to configure. So breaking this down a little bit further, go to our next slide here. So basically, configuration management, it provides a declarative based configuration. And so what I mean by declarative is that means that it's taking, it's taking a text file and it's allowing you to define exactly what the end result of that node should be. So you don't have to know the exact steps to get to that end result, which is a little different from the way that we do things now today with things like PowerShell. This is very much this is what I want it to end up looking like. We're going to use this configuration management tool to go out there and do it for us. So then we don't have to worry about those individual steps. It does it in an idempotent way. That means that it's repeatable. So it doesn't matter how many times you run this configuration, the end result is always going to be the same. It's also nice in the way that it kind of unifies the configuration, because you can apply these, or you can use the same configuration management concepts and ideas across several different items within your environment. In terms of DSC, you're probably more used to using that against your guest OS or your operating system, features and firewall rules and things of that nature. But then you can also expand that out to also cover different things. What I'll be talking about here is using this against a VMware vSphere environment. And it kind of brings us to conformance as well, because now you have this declarative-based configuration file saying that this is what my infrastructure looks like. This is the end result. So this is now documentation, so that we can take this from our source control. Hopefully everybody in the room is using source control. We can say, hey, this is the way that it looks. And by using source control, we can kind of tell a story about the changes that have gone on with our different configuration files. As well as, if you're one of those poor souls that have to go through audit reviews, you can also just hand over the code and say, this is exactly what it's set to be, and kind of take it from there. I'm going to skip over the why it matters. Can you see the configuration management breakdown slide?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, cool. Because this one has animations, and that would be really rough to try and, I would have to interpretive dance it. So in this case, high level overview of the way that this kind of works. We have our node off to the right-hand side. Since we're talking about VMware-based technologies, we'll call it a VM. Then we're going to have our configuration file. This is that file that defines what we want our node to look like. It's standard text-based, and I'll have some examples about what that looks like here shortly. Then we have our point of control, or the system who actually handles and manages how that configuration is applied. Then generally that central server or that central point of control has a repository. Again, source control, super good to be using here. That repository is going to have a link to to somewhere on the central server where the configuration is going to live, which is then in our point of control. So then at this point, since we've already created our configuration file, it's there, it exists, our central server is ready to establish a communication with our node. So, depending upon which technology you're using for config management, this could be WinRM, this could be SSH, this could be, agent-based. It could be any number of things. But the point here is that the central server creates a connection to our node, tosses our configuration file over to it, and then starts configuring that node. So we can do things such as firewall rules and NTP. We can also do some pretty crazy stuff like setting up a database or a multi-tiered application. So we can do all kinds of crazy stuff, especially in the world of PowerShell. If we can do it with PowerShell, there is a chance that we can do it with DSC. So at that point, once our configuration has completed, we're going to sever that tie because we don't need to maintain that stream of communication. That doesn't need to persist. And then from that point forward, generally every 15 minutes, or depending upon which tool you're using, it will reach back out to that node and verify what the configuration is. And then based upon what it receives back, what it reports back, you can make some decisions whether or not you should either make changes, or you can just report those changes that, something is out of whack, and then it tells you about it so that you have near real-time monitoring of what's going on with the nodes that are being used with your configuration management tools. Some of the options that normally come up and I hear about the most, we're talking Ansible, Chef, Puppet. Salt Stack is coming up more and more, as well as DSC. As DSC continues to evolve and grow, it's starting to gain some momentum, which is very nice to see. Here's a further breakdown, thanks to some help from the good folks at DigitalOcean, to try and describe the differences between some of these config management options. Now, this is mainly taken from the VMware perspective. So like for the scripting language, Ansible, you can use Python. I learned at Ansible Fest just a couple weeks ago, you can now start using Go. I think there are a couple things out there in Ruby, but when it comes to the VMware resources, it's mainly Python based. Chef and Puppet are Ruby, Salt Stack is all Python, and of course, PowerShell DSC, it's going to be PowerShell. They all have their own different pieces for their infrastructure and their central point of control. They all have their own scripting terminology. Chef kind of makes a play off of their name with recipes and cookbooks. However, when it comes to PowerShell DSC, it's configurations and resources. And then mainly all of them are going to be sequential based. Puppet's a little bit of an oddball there, but you can force it to be sequential if you need it to be. The one thing that's not on here that is important, all of these tools are open source. So very cool from that perspective. You can get into, you can issue or create issues, you can open up pull requests. Most of these folks are very open and willing to work with the community. So here's a little bit of an Ansible example. Just very basic. We have the name of the task that we're performing there at the top line. Then we have VMware host NTP. That's going to be the Ansible module that it's going to be using. From that point, we have our authentication. So we have our host name, our username and password. And then from there, since this particular one is changing the NTP servers or validating the NTP servers for ESXi hosts in a given cluster, then we're going to specify our cluster name. Then the important part comes down below that. So having our state saying, we do want this to exist. This is present. And then specifying our NTP servers. So you don't need to know anything about Python or really Ansible in general to be able to use this config management module, and to be able to apply this to your VMware environment. That's some of the power of configuration management, not having to be, extremely well-versed in whatever programming language is being used underneath. You just need to understand, in Ansible's case, the YAML files, how to create those. Then for something that's maybe more, a little more advanced or a little more difficult, that takes a couple steps to go through. So this is using the Ansible module for URI. And basically what the URI module does is it reaches out to a REST-based endpoint. It allows you to run or perform different tasks. So what we have here is we have our first task that's there. That's just our basic vCenter login. So if we can get a little fancy here, we have our URL here. It comes off to our REST API endpoint that's here by the URL. Oops. And then we just go on over to our session. That creates the authentication. We're passing in a username and password. Of course, just remember password as part of this session, I'm using plain text passwords. You never want to do that in real life. A majority of these config management tools have different ways to encrypt and store those passwords. Ansible has a Vault product. DSC will use something like certificates to manage passwords. But for the sake of these these examples, I'm just using plain text. Then for the bottom, our next one down there is our disable SSH. So we're just reaching out to our appliance there. Again, REST API endpoint, appliance, access, SSH, pretty straightforward in understanding that. And then performing our put, which means that we're going to change something. And then we're telling Ansible to look at this JSON file that literally the content of it is just off. But the important part down there is the headers, the bottom 2 lines. That's going to be how we pass what we receive from our top, our vCenter login task, and how we pass that into our disable SSH task. That's a little more complex. You have to have a little bit of an understanding of how a REST API works, but still fairly basic in the scheme of things. So I'll cruise through this stuff really fast. We're at a PowerShell user group, so I'm sure you all know what PowerShell is. Just a fairly straightforward, simple path to automation, extremely easy to use with its verb, noun, setup. Everything out there is verb-noun. Super easy to consume, very easy to understand or at least try to understand what's happening in there. Big and cool thing, it's multi-platform, so you can run it on Linux, you can use it on Mac OS. The current version of PowerShell Core, I believe we're up to 6.3, and there's the tech previews of PowerShell 7 that's already out there that includes some really cool stuff. And PowerShell also open sourced, completely mind-blowing for those of us who have been using PowerShell forever since some of the early days. Seeing that open sourced, crazy. Quick little blurb about what PowerCLI is. If you are at this user group meeting and you have a VMware environment, hopefully you know what it is, but just in case you don't, this is VMware's extension for PowerShell. So we're up to, I believe, 21 different modules, housing somewhere around 721 different commandlets, managing almost every aspect of the VMware suite. We've got everything from vSphere, of course, to VMware Cloud on AWS, NSXT, Site Recovery Manager, VROps, HCX, all kinds of stuff. Pretty much, if you can think about it, we've tried to make that available through PowerCLI. So with that, let's dive into some specifics about DSC. So this is kind of the way that DSC works. So we have our user configuration file that's there in the middle. From that configuration file, that's going to use a standard PS1 PowerShell script language inside of that. And then from there, it's compiled and created into MOF files or managed object format files. These MOF files are created on a one-to-one basis for each node that's going to be managed by DSC. So in this case, we're using one configuration file against 2 different nodes, and then it creates 2 different MOF files. And if you're managing 3 nodes, 15 nodes, 100 nodes, that's how many MOFs are going to be created. Now those MOFs are then sent off to the nodes that DSC is managing. And the important part that's going to be running on those nodes is this idea, this concept, this service called LCM, or Local Configuration Manager. That the local configuration manager is going to be what takes those MOF files, interprets it, and completes the actions required on each one of those nodes. So here's a sample configuration file. So we have the first line there just defining what our configuration is going to be called. On the third line, we have the nodes that we're going to be assigning this to. Taking our visual example from the slide before and changing that into this, we're going to be applying it to our local host system as well as a node by the name of server 01. And for both of these nodes, we're going to be ensuring that there are some services present. So we can see lines 4 through 7 there. We're making sure that our remote administrative tools are going to be present. And then on lines 9 through 12, we're ensuring that BitLocker is present. And notice we don't have to do this on a per system basis. We can just use that array up at the top and configure it from there. It'll churn out the MOF files as needed. And line 16 there is what's actually going to compile the MOF. So let's start talking about these resources for our VMware environments. So this is a fairly new project, as I mentioned before. I like to consider this kind of a Christmas present to at least myself. This was released in mid to late December of last year. It's called VMware.vSphere DSC. This is something that is now available out there on the PowerShell gallery. So as easy as it is to install PowerCLI, you can now do install module VMware.vSphere DSC, make that available on your local system. And this is just, taking the years of engineering effort. We're at 12 some years of engineering effort in the PowerCLI and applying this towards DSC. This too is open source, so that is huge. This is one of the first things for PowerCLI that has ever been open sourced. So we very much welcome contributions, whether or not that's an issue, a feature request, pull requests, anything. We are absolutely welcoming of all things. And there are some dependencies. So DSC, prior to PowerShell 7, is Windows based. So that means that we have to have at least PowerShell 5.1. And furthermore, I should also clarify, so these resources are using classes. So that is what puts us into PowerShell 5.1. So we have to have a Windows box. It has to be running PowerShell 5.1. We also need or are required to have at least PowerCLI 10.1.1. Now the current version of PowerCLI is 11.4, and we from VMware always recommend being on the latest and greatest version. But for this instance, you need to at least have 10.1.1. Then we also need to be able to run PowerShell as an administrator. That's how the MOF file is created and applied. And we also need to have both PowerCLI and the vSphere DSC modules available on the system that's running the LCM. And the system that's running the LCM is kind of an important concept because everything that I've talked about here recently has been Windows systems. Now, if you're familiar with our current vCenter servers and certainly our ESXi servers, those aren't Windows based. So there's no such thing as LCM on these non-Windows based systems. So we have to have what's known as an LCM proxy. This LCM proxy, that's where your PowerShell 5.1 and your PowerCLI modules need to live, and it also has that requirement of being a Windows box. So from that point, for our demonstrations that I'll get to here in just a second, we've got our configuration file and our LCM that lives on that proxy. And then from there, it's going to reach out to our vCenter servers and or ESXi servers. So that's one other important distinction here about what's happening is that there is no requirement, there's no licensing requirement when you're using these DSC resources. Now, the one caveat to that is that ESXi servers need to be at least basic licensed, because if you're on the free license, that doesn't open up API access. So kind of keep that in mind. But otherwise, you don't have to have like Enterprise Plus or anything crazy. So here's a sample configuration file. Again, first line, that's just naming what our configuration is going to be called. Line 2 is where we're importing our DSC resource. We're only going to be applying this to our local host, so we don't need to worry about setting up an array. We're going to create our credential there on line 5 and 6. Then 8 is where we actually get into these PowerCLI-based DSC resources. So we're going to again be setting our NTP settings for hosts. We have our name. And so what I mean by name is the setting, the parameter for the system that we're looking to configure with DSC. This is our target resource that we're going to be configuring. Then we have our server parameter. The server parameter is the same thing as what you type into like connect VI server. So if you're connecting to a vCenter server, that's your vCenter name. If you're connecting to an ESXi host, that's your ESXi host. Then credential is your standard credential object. Then NTP server, NTP service policy. We're just setting up 0.pool.ntp.org and setting it to be automatic. And then down there at the bottom on line 18 is where we're compiling our MOF. So let's talk about what's available. So right now, this is not something that's feature complete. You can't manage your entire vSphere environment with it. We're not yet to that point. Again, open source project, welcome all contributions. But so far what we do have are things for our vCenter server like statistics and logging levels, the ability to create data centers and clusters, update some of the task-based items like our task and events, the max age that's stored on there, message of the day, things of that nature. We can also do quite a few things on the ESXi side, such as managing services like NTP, DNS, creating storage claim rules, transparent page sharing settings, syslog, and other various services that are available. And also fairly recently, and shout out to Luke Deakins for being kind of the mastermind behind this, the ability to manage standard switches on ESXi hosts. That's been a pretty crazy and impressive resource that he's built and contributed. Then we also have some things like PowerCLI settings. So if you've ever done a set PowerCLI configuration to, say, manage the, how it handles invalid certificates, whether or not you can connect to multiple vCenter servers, things of that nature. You can also do that through DSC. Some of the things that we're still working on. We're working on some of the advanced standard switch resources, such as managing some of the security and shaping, as well as teaming for each one of those switches and port groups. Working on some of the more advanced cluster-based resources for HA and DRS settings, things like anti-affinity rules, and some of the more in-depth HA configs. Some of the other VM host things that we're still working on, PCI pass-through is a big thing. Everybody is very interested, it seems, in getting into GPU usage, and so that's been a pretty big request. As well as some of those advanced settings that maybe there isn't a high-level PowerCLI commandlet for. So let's get into some demos. Let me share my other screen here. New share, remote desktop. All right, so can everybody see a vSphere client?
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome, great. So here's my demo environment. It's extremely basic. It's a 6.5 environment. I don't even think it has update 1 or anything. Trying to make this about as basic as possible. I do have a data center and a demo cluster that's been created. I'll get into reasons why these exist later, but fairly basic, no folder structures, no data stores even. So let's take a look at our DSC configuration here. I'm not going to compile it or make any changes here because that does take a little bit to run the very first time. So here's a configuration file that I've gone through and created. So as part of this, we're going to make several different changes to that vSphere environment. So up here at the top, we have our configuration data.
We can currently still see vSphere client.
Oh, let's see. I wonder if I'm going to have to. Why is sharing of my screen paused? How about now?
Now we can see it. Yes, perfect.
Can you see it scrolling?
Nope.
Awesome. Thank you, Zoom. All right, so let me try and share my entire screen again. Let me see if I can't change. Can I change this to black screen? All right, can we see my configuration file again?
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome.
You can see it moving and scrolling. Yes. Perfect.
Okay. Now that we're all good. All right. So this is a sample configuration file. We're going to take that vSphere screen that I showed you earlier, and we're going to make some changes to that environment. We're also going to use some standard PowerShell coding techniques to make this a little easier. So in this case, we're creating an array. It's kind of overkill for what we're trying to do, but this would allow you to also be able to connect and make these changes to different vCenter servers. In this use case, in this demo, we're only going to be connecting to the one. We have things like our server name, our username, password, and then we're going to create some folders. So I have a VMware or a VM folder variable that's here. Then if we scroll down a little bit, we have our configuration. We're going to call this vCenter config. Again, importing our DSC resource. And then for each of those vCenters that were in that top bracket, we're going to run through this. So we're going to establish our server variable, user password, and credential. Everybody should be fairly familiar with that. Then we're going to create a data center. So there's a DSC resource that's out there called data center within these vSphere DSC resources. So we're going to create a data center that's called DuPSUG, the name of the user group. We're also going to tell it that we want that to ensure to be present. Then we're going to create a cluster, and we're going to name it Yop is awesome because, well, Yop is awesome. We're going to do some things beyond that, such as saying that this is going to have to live in our DuPSUG data center. We're going to ensure that this is present. We're going to take some of those HA and DRS configurations that are already available, such as being able to turn HA on, be able to turn DRS on, and apply those. Then the important part down here is that we have a depends on parameter. This is saying that it depends on our data center object. Now, one of the things that might get a little confusing here is that we're calling out the data center, the module, the resource that's being used, and then the name for that object. Now, this isn't the actual data center name. This is what we've called it. This is equivalent to this line right here, line 45. And that'll become even more apparent below. Then we have a for each loop. This is where we're going to be creating some folder structures here. So for each one of those folders in that top level item, it was production, development, and management. We're going to create those folders plus some nested folders. So for our nested folders here, we're using, issuing a variable as part of our name for the object. We're going to be creating a Windows folder, which is going to depend on that prior folder existing. Then we're going to create a Linux folder. And then after our for each loop returns, we're going to then create a VMware folder that's going to live in our management folder. So we're creating a complete folder structure here. And at the bottom, we have our where we compile our MOF files. So we're only creating one MOF file. I've already performed the compiling process, and I kind of wanted to show you because it is all still plain text for the purposes of this demo. You can also apply some certificate-based security to these MOF files so you can't actually read them. The big thing that I want to call out here, do not modify the MOF file. Treat these as read-only. If you need to recreate the MOF file or change some settings, make that to your configuration file and recreate the MOF files. But, we can see some of the things that we created before, talking about a credential object here, usage of an HA composite resource that's in our DSC resources, making sure that YAP is awesome, does exist as a cluster, so on and so forth. So now that we've covered all of that, we know what our configuration kind of looks like. We're going to go ahead and move over and actually run this. So let's change over to my documents, GitHub, DSC configs, and then demo lab. So in our demo lab, we have our demo lab config PS1. That's what we were looking at in Visual Studio Code. Then we have our vCenter config folder, which is where the MOF file lives. So we can now do a start DSC configuration, point it to the path of where our MOF file lives. For the purposes of this demo, we're going to do a wait, which basically means if there are any other DSC processes, the wait means that we're going to wait for the process to complete. We're going to watch it, we're going to watch this progress bar as it runs. And then we're also going to use a force. The force just says, cancel out any other DSC processes that are running. We want this thing to run right now. So we're going to run that. And then this can take a little bit of time, but I've already ran it for the first time, and so it should go fairly quickly. So let me minimize our demo DC and all the objects that are there, and expand out our tasks. So hopefully here we will start to see some tasks roll in. Oh, it is still preparing the modules for the first use. So it might take a second or two longer here. Oops.
So this is because it's the first time you're running this, or is this startup time always this long?
It will generally be for the first time that you run it. The first time that you run start DSC configuration. When DSC reaches back out every time, the default for DSC is around 15 minutes. Every time it reaches out then after, it'll be much faster. Come on, demo lab, don't fail me now. I don't remember changing anything. It shouldn't take this long.
So you mentioned that we should never touch the MOF files.
Yes.
Can you explain why we shouldn't do that? Because it seems quite easy to modify. I mean, I can read it, so I can modify it, right?
I mean, you can modify it if you want to, but it's definitely not best practice to modify that. For best practices and kind of following the DSC way, it's to make those changes at the configuration file level, and then recreate the MOF file, and that just kind of validates and applies some sanity to the MOF file itself. Oh, there we go. Finally have some action. So we have our data center that's been created here, DuPSUG. We've got our YAP is awesome cluster. We can see some of the other tasks rolling through. But one of the things that I wanted to show, DRS is not turned on by default. So this is something that DSC went ahead and configured. Same thing with HA. It has been turned on. Then if we switch over to our VMs and templates view, expanding out the DuPSUG data center, we can start seeing some of the folders being created. So management already has its Linux and Windows folders. Production already has its Linux and Windows folders. Then development should start receiving its different folders now. And then at the end, because DSC is sequential based, we will see that VMware folder pop into management. So there we have our entire folder structure that's been rolled out. One of the things that I do want to also call out here is that notice nothing changed in the demo DC environment. Like discovered virtual machines is still there. If we click back over to the hosts and clusters view, you know, the demo data center is still there. Those 4 hosts are still there. It's not modified any of that. And that's simply because we didn't tell our configuration file to make any of those changes. So one of the things that's always kind of cool to do, we can remove our entire management folder. And then so with that management folder gone, we can then run through our configuration again. Notice this time it didn't say applying this for the first time. So it just goes directly into applying configuration. And so even though we deleted that management folder, you know, we can still see the delete folder task right down here with my credentials there. We can now see folders being created underneath, you know, the management folder being created and those nested folders being created as well. As this is running, the other thing that I want to point out is our username. Now, of course, I passed in administrator at vSphere.local. So, you know, you probably want to use something that is something a little more like a service account in your environments. So you don't just see like, hey, why is Yap making all of these changes? He's not even, you know, he's not even connected to the environment. So then at least you have kind of a heads up at what's happening. So that's let's see, yep, did that finish? Okay, all finished, all good. So let's head back to the PowerPoint for just one more demo. I will skip through the pre-recorded. No, go forward. There we go. So there is one more thing. So earlier in the session, I went through all of those configuration management tools for a reason. And that's because DSC is one of the nicer utilities when it comes to config management because it can be used with almost all of those utilities. In fact, I think all the ones that I discussed, Ansible, Chef, Puppet, and SaltStack all have their own DSC-based resource so that you can make use of DSC with those. And in fact, this year, you know, here's a little bit of a hot take alert here. DSC is a platform interface. This is something that came directly from Michael Green, who's the product manager, you know, the owner of DSC itself. This happened out at PowerShell Summit earlier this year. You know, April 29th, Michael Green up on stage in front of everybody at the PowerShell and DevOps Summit. He's like, DSC is a platform interface for other configuration management technologies. You know, I think that's something that's missed in a lot of use cases and in a lot of, you know, folks who are using this. Like DSC is extremely easy to integrate into just about every config management tool on the planet. So, you know, it doesn't matter if you already have Ansible or if you already have Chef or Puppet, you know, if you're already using those tools in your environment, you can integrate DSC in a really easy way. So let me tell this to not play here. And let's do a live demo. This one's always a fun one. So we're going to go, this is what we're going to be using our ESXi hosts for here. And I don't, so we right now have SSH has been enabled. Actually, if I'm right, it actually shouldn't be enabled. So we might have to make a little bit of a change there. But services, SSH, nope, SSH is running. Let me verify so that I can modify our config file here. Yep, okay, SSH is running. All right, so we're going to, we just validated that in the vSphere client. So then we're going to go out to a location which is running the Ansible core system, the Ansible core engine. So out here, we have a playbook that's been created, a YAML file, as it were, that's going to use our DSC resources. So playbooks. So we're going to go into our YAML file right here. So up top, we have our host. This host system is going to point to that DSC master 01 system. That's what I've been remoted into. That's where we are running DSC from locally. And then from there, we're going to run a task, one specific task. And this is going to be calling out our WinDSC Ansible resource, or Ansible module, I'm sorry. And then we're going to be using a DSC resource from the VMware project there that's called VM host service. We're going to be making use of a loop, a standard, fairly basic loop, to go through each of our hosts that have been listed down here below. We have our server and our credentials that have been stored in here. If you'll notice, I updated this to be using a DSC service account. We're then going to modify our TSM-SSH service to tell it to have a policy of off and a running state of false. So let me quit that. And then we can just run Ansible playbook, and then playbooks DSC Ansible YAML. So we're going to use Ansible to reach out, as we can see by our play line right here. It's going to reach out to our DSC M01 system. It's going to be gathering a couple facts, trying to figure out what it's going to be doing on top of that. And then it's going to run that task that we specified to modify the SSH service of our hosts. So this will take just a little bit of a second. Let me see if I can't. So then hopefully here we will start seeing some tasks, some changes pop up, showing some of the changes that have been that are occurring here. And there's no real reason, I should also specify, like this isn't a plug for Ansible. This is just something that I tossed together. I had Ansible running in a different environment while I was prepping for a session for Ansible Fest. And, Chef has a similar way of doing this. Puppet, SaltStack, they can all do the same or very similar things. Come on. The joys of live demos. Any second now. And so one of the questions that often comes up is, does this remove the requirement of that Windows and the proxy LCM box? And, no, this doesn't. This is absolutely still reaching out to that proxy box and making use of LCM to perform those tasks. So this isn't a way to get rid of that Windows system. Now, PowerShell 7 and some of the stuff that is going to be coming with that will open the door to some fairly interesting potential future items that we could make use of. From my testing so far, invoke DSC resource, which I believe is the commandlet that's going to be out there. Okay, that's interesting. It's saying it's checking against these systems and saying that it's okay. Fun. Oh, demo gods. Huh. Anyways, we started a little late, so I don't want to diagnose that too much. But anyways, you kind of saw that that's how it will look. In reality, we should see some things that look like changes instead of okays. Let me go back to the demo here. Run through to yeah. Here's the way that it should have looked. It should have looked like those 4 hosts changed. And then we kind of get a play recap there at the end, explaining what happened. So apologies for that not working the way that it should, but you know, recorded backup video has got me, and that's the way that it should look. One last thing before I hand this back over. You know, again, this is something that's open source. This is something that we're looking for all kinds of input about. We do have an open request for comment. So right now we are working through kind of a process of some of the, you know, so we're using composite resources with this DSC set of DSC resources. So that creates some challenges in the way that we handle the directory layout and how we name certain things. So we have an open RFC right now. So if you have any thoughts or any ideas really about how to, or, you know, some guidance about how we should formulate and you know, if and or when we should make changes to the way that this resource, this DSC resource is using those resources and using classes. You know, Gail and a couple other folks have already voiced their opinions. So, you know, please reach out and let us know. We're absolutely open to ideas and making changes to, you know, follow the PowerShell best practices and make this, you know, as best of a PowerShell DSC resource as we can. So with that, I'll leave you with the link to where the DSC resources are. As always, you know, if you have any comments, questions, follow-ups, please reach out on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way to reach out to me. I have far less DMs than I do emails. So I'll look at Twitter way before I will my email. So with that, thank you all for coming, and hopefully this is something that's interesting, and I look forward to everybody's feedback. So thank you.
Do you want to take some questions now, Kyle? You can take 1 or 2 questions. I think we can take 1 or 2.
Okay.
Anyone have a question? In the back, yes.
So are there plans to make PowerCLI and DSC modules available for PowerShell 7?
Are there any plans to make the modules available for PowerShell 7?
Yes. So we are still working through some of the processes to get it to work with PowerShell 7. PowerShell 7 is going to widely open the door for what we can do with the invoke DSC resource commandlet. You know, as soon as we do not have that dependency on a Windows box, you know, we can do all sorts of crazy things. And that's kind of the process that we're going down right now. We've been working very closely with Michael Green on how that's going to look, as well as Joey. You know, we have biweekly meetings with them, so we're trying to make this as streamlined as possible. And so yeah, our goal is to, you know, if we don't support these resources with PowerShell 7 day 1. It won't be very long after PowerShell 7 is released that we'll be able to support it. Any
Okay.
other questions?
We'll leave it at that.
Awesome.
Kyle, thank you very much for taking the time to join our user group. And I'm sure I'm going to see you at some point somewhere around the world soon.
Definitely. Thank you all for having me.
Thank you.